STOA this year, I checked, I believe this is by a significant margin of about 25%, the largest Parli tournament in the nation. It may stay the largest depending on how Concordia goes. So this is quite a feat. Congratulations, you have really done well on it. So feel free to grab a seat. I know it's a little uncomfortable sometimes standing there looking at judges for standing by. If you want to sit, stand, however you do, just no cartwheels, please. All right, so I've been tasked 30 seconds before this thing that I got a call to say I'll do this. So if I mispronounce, I apologize because I had no time to prep. I'm trying my best, but I'm just a Chinese dude. English is, you know. Anyway, so all right. I'm not the show. I'm trying to keep you awake. But, by the way, is it still warm? I'm so sorry. I just. Can you please turn the AC on A208? A208 Moses over. Thank you. They did turn it on. All right. Alan Mondragon. Is that right? Thank you so much. 20 years old, currently studying at Cal State San Bernardino. I have judged their competitions for about 2 years. And so you're a community judge. We are very grateful that you came. And I noticed even with the cast on your feet, so this is commitment. And Pastor Mike Berry. Mike Pastor, a very fine man indeed, a godly man. He's a STOA parent, second year as Parli coach, and a phenomenal inter coach. Really a man after own God's heart. We really appreciate it. Our whole church leaned very much on his theological expertise. We have many churches in our pastor. So thank you, Mike, for coming. And then Heather Carey Lakey. Oh, L-E-K-Y, sorry. I can't read either. I can speak English and I can't read. So, 10-year homeschool mom, give her a medal, to 4 children. Book ended from a kindergartner through a senior, so you got many years left, right, in this cult called STOA. And her oldest has participated in STOA for the past 4 years. And you have served extensively all over, including ballot return. Am I correct? Ballot push. So, and you know, ballot push is tough because parents are hiding in the bathroom. And Evan Buck, one of the most enthusiastic young men in the history of STOA. He enters the room and he lights it up. All right. So he's been blessed to have been in STOA. You wrote a whole essay. I'm going to have to trim it. I apologize. But no. With speech and debate for 7 years, and I've done Parli for 4 years. Currently, I think you're a business finance major at Cal State. You actually work for a business blog where they actually pay you to write professional business articles. As a young man, as a freshman, you do that in high school. So it was a coach. You're also a coach for the LD debate at Control. And it's an honor to judge the final Parli round, and I'm looking forward to a great debate. Also a financial writer, yes, we mentioned that. So thank you, Evan, for driving all the way back to help us with the Parli final. Reagan Anderson, another of our alumni who competed for 6 years. 5 years of LD and 1 year of Parli, and he's seeking his Master's of Theology already?
Well, not the Master's, I'm just starting.
Oh, starting. Okay, I was seeking his Master's of Theology. I thought, boy, you were a boy genius. That's fantastic. So, it took me like 7 years. So, Reagan hopes to become a professor of theology. So, thank you. At STOA too, the Anderson, like the Mr. and Mrs. Timer ran your own tournaments and whatnot, so we really appreciate it. Matthew Shipley, parent, thank you Matthew, and you've been so encouraging. Every time I come up, you shake my hand, you smile at me, you pat me on the shoulder. So I really, you know, well maybe not pat me on the shoulder, but you always, so I appreciate that. Parent of 2 STOA debaters and 2 STOA timers. You're dead. We are short for timers, so thank you. Sorry, I'm not music, a master's in education administration, superintendent of a public school district, 3 years of judging experience in STOA, Parli, TP, LD, IE. Values, So that values honor, integrity, logic, and rhetoric. He forgot to put his wife on there, but he meant his wife also. So, thank you. Logan Bechtel began speech and debate 14 years ago, worked 36 years for Santa Fe, BNSF, Railway, locomotive engineer and mechanic, father of 4 homeschool speech and debate grads, and he's very humble. The wife was director of ICC before we had the privilege of being her assistant, and she's still helping us. And I said today, and I've said every day, she still knows more about ICC than Wayne Johnson and I combined, except for Tab. And I really do mean it. I am a pastor, so I speak the truth. Thank you very much. We're saving the best for last. So this is not the best second. So this is Josh Johnson. All right, Josh Johnson is a Stowe alumni who competes in various events of speech and debate, including 2 years of Parli. He currently attends Biola University, studying communications, member of Biola's Great Books program, the Torrey Honors Institute, and deeply enjoys leading and discussing classic literature with friends and family. Josh is passionate about Stowe vision for providing an atmosphere where students may grow in their speaking and debating skills, but most importantly in their growth as young men and women in our Lord Jesus Christ. Any mothers want to take application for your daughters? And I will say this, I know Josh very well. Joshua is one of the most godly young men of his age that I know in my lifetime. And when he graduated from our club, it was a huge loss. And we call him Captain America, and it fits everything. So thank you, Joshua. Finally, we saved the best for last. Don McHugh. Don McHugh. And so you're the director of the Redlands, which is one of the best cities in the Inland Empire. Actually, I think it's the best city. A.K. Smiley Public Library in Redlands since 2013. For 26 prior years, he was the archivist, curator for the library where he was responsible for the Lincoln Memorial Shrine, the only museum dedicated to the Abraham Lincoln in the West. So you really should come next year for LD Finals, and I will make it a point to save you a spot. But tomorrow he has a Lincoln luncheons or all-day event.
It's our open house at the Lincoln Shrine. Anyone interested in Abraham Lincoln or the American Civil War, we're going to have reenactors, cavalry, infantry, artillery, and a new exhibit, a big free party for Abraham Lincoln.
That's right, and that's why you couldn't do the LD tomorrow. We would have you as an honored guest. And my parents, very attractive event, but you are obligated, your salvation is on the line. You're going to stay unjudged. You're going to stay unjudged, as attractive as that is.
We love homeschoolers as well, so
yes.
please come use it.
So, yes. So thank you, Don. I know you're extremely busy, but you were kind enough to come, and I think you'll be thrilled tonight. So thank you so much, Don. So without further ado,
excuse me. I was
yes.
wondering if the competitors
Yeah, I
would
forgot to
be
ask.
willing to have us, could we videotape this round?
We're okay with it? Absolutely. Okay. Yes.
Maybe we could get the floors open until
Yes.
the AC comes on.
And I'll call them again.
Johnson, good luck, man.
All right.
Thank you, sir. My pleasure. Thank you. See you in a minute.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, sir, for coming here. Hope you feel better. Thank you for your time here. Thank you so much for being back. Thank you for your time. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you, man. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you, sir. Really appreciate your time. Time today. fact of the matter is everyone in this room was either homeschooled as a homeschool parent. We see that education is extremely important. The fact of the matter is, though, my partner and I are going to be telling you why education doesn't matter. Totally just kidding. We're not going to be saying that. What we're actually going to be looking at is the prioritization of putting healthcare above education when it is in conflict. Now, I actually forgot an actual copy of the resolution, so if I can get that really quick and I can read that to you guys. So what it actually says, when in conflict, government should prioritize healthcare over education. My partner and I are going to be affirming this, showing to you that it needs to be first when in conflict. Not that education is unimportant, but that healthcare needs to be first. So with that said, we're going to present a value that you can judge today's debate round off of, which is that the value of life. The value of life. Now, the reason why we want you to refer this value in today's debate round is not because it's foundational. Basically, you need life to do any of this listed as a debate round or even gain an education. It's a foundational principle that needs to be in the entire round. If you don't have any health, then you can't actually participate in anything that goes on. It's foundational. The second point is that it's intrinsic. Basically, what intrinsic means is that the value doesn't change. No matter what happens, the value won't change under any circumstance. The criterion for judging today's debate round is whichever side upholds life better. Whichever side can better uphold this in today's debate round, we ask that at the end you put your ballot to. With that said, let's go ahead and get to contentions, the actual substance of today's debate round. The first contention is that of healthcare upholds life. Healthcare upholds life. Got a few subpoints under here. Subpoint A is the idea of young and old. Young and old. Now the fact of the matter is we have varying ranges in today's debate round. We have variances on age ranges, but we see that healthcare is provided to both young and old. We see that education specifically targets younger people. Yes, we do have older people who are in community college, but really, when we look at the overall benefits, we see that education is mostly focused on the younger. What we see is that things like measles and vaccinations are actually at schools to guarantee that they have health, that way they can even participate in education. So we see an example that is basically across the board, and they're concerned with this actual idea. The second thing is subpoint B, which is that of for society. For society. This point is basically going to talk about how they always have to be in conflict because budget cuts. Basically, when in conflict, things like budgets, etc., these are some of the conflicts that can arise, and when budget battles happen, we need to give that money actually to healthcare, not to things like education, because it's more important for healthcare. Which leads me into subpoint C, which is that of mental illness. We actually look at one of the things that healthcare actually affects, and that would be included, is that of mental illness. A few examples of this would be like Tourette's and dyslexia, which are actually learning disabilities. If you can't actually provide with them the healthcare necessary to learn, then they can't actually improve in any sort of educational stance. Yes, good question.
Do you think it's better to educate or to medicate someone with dyslexia?
What I would actually say is it's actually work on healthcare to fix the problem so they can have learning help, basically. So you need the healthcare first so that they can actually be able to learn. That's part of healthcare, basically mentoring them through the program. So with that said, the next thing to look at is the impact, which the impact to this point is basically the idea of a lot of the time people with healthcare actually start school violence. School violence. A lot of the gun shootings, one of the things that comes up in these gun shootings is the idea about mental health. Are these people actually stable? And we see that when you actually don't have stable people who actually have necessary vaccinations, necessary medication, it actually leads to things like what happened in school shootings. Basically, that ends education's life in that manner. The next thing to look at is that of subpoint D, which is that of third world economies. Third world economies. If you look across the world, a lot of in third world countries, they don't have the ability to actually go to school because they're so mentally disabled can't get any health care like we have in the U.S. We have basically some health care in the U.S., and so you have some ability to actually get that. In third world countries, they don't have that, and it actually impacts their entirety of their education. With that said, we see that health care is the number one thing that can uphold life. Contention 2 is showing a contrast between these two. A contrast between these two. Subpoint A is that of standard objective. Standard objective. Basically, we have to look at what can be actually objectified, and we see that the only thing that is objective in today's debate round would be that of healthcare. First point is that education changes with politics. Education changes with politics. As you can see in this room, basically, we have homeschoolers. Obviously, a lot of you probably are opposed to Common Core. One of the things that education has ended up changing with politics. Healthcare doesn't actually change with politics, doesn't have that ability to change because of that. Yes, to your second question.
I was just going to ask, doesn't healthcare change with politics as well? For example, once Obama entered office, he implemented Obamacare.
I would say that definitely can be manipulated like Obamacare, but the fact of the matter is, when it comes down to the core principle, what can be manipulated more is education. I'm about to get to that. North Korea basically is a dictatorship, and what they ended up doing is they manipulate their education to make people believe different things. The fact of the matter is, education is natural. You don't need actual dictatorships or governments to actually control education learning. You need them to provide the healthcare if you can't get healthcare. You need someone to provide that education. You don't need someone to provide it. You can learn on your own. We see that it actually is more beneficial when you compare them. Healthcare is needed. With that said, the impact is clear. We need to clearly prioritize this point. The next thing to look at is that of subpoint B. This is just going to tie into the contrasting, which is 1 in every 5 adolescents has mental problems. Now this is from the NAME National Alliance on Healthcare, and basically this worldwide, doing a worldwide survey and polls, had a bunch of countries listed. Basically every 1 in 5 adolescents actually has this problem. The next point is that things aren't being done currently. Things aren't being done currently. Currently we see that if every 1 in every 5 adolescents have this problem, that things aren't currently being done to healthcare. What's ended up happening is education has ended up decreasing. Education has ended up decreasing. Basically the people without this good healthcare, education has been decreasing because they can't actually work in the industries as well. They can't actually create manufacturing and grow development if you don't have a good education. Again, 1 in every 5. So what we see is that impacts into is if we had good healthcare education, we would be able to advance basically the objectives that are going on within U.S. health production, grow, basically increase the education overall if you start with healthcare. At the end of today's debate round, you need to understand one core thing. Education is a natural cause that anyone can deal with. Healthcare, you can't get that provided. You can't get that ability without someone actually providing that for you or giving you some sort of assistance. So when they get in conflict, we see that education needs to be under healthcare. For all these reasons, I encourage affirmative ballot. Thank you.
In this first opposition speech, I hope to make it obvious that education should be valued above healthcare. I'd like to start off by agreeing with their value, that this is indeed a value resolution. However, I think that their value itself is too black and white. It doesn't leave enough room for debate. So I'd like to present a counter value of that of quality of life. I think this provides more room for debate, and when we're talking about healthcare and education, often they don't directly impact life or death situations, but it's much easier to debate about the quality of life and which one helps more people the most. So with that established, I'd like to move into a criterion, or a means of achieving the value. If our value is quality of life, the best way to achieve that is through economic advancement. So whichever team provides you with more economic advancement gives you higher quality of life and therefore should win the debate round. Now I'd like to briefly move into one observation. This you can write down as valued above. Valued above. The Gov has a burden to prove that healthcare should be valued above education. If at the end of the day you're left not really sure which one is more important, the resolution has not been proved true and your vote should go to the opposition team.
Yes, who determines whether your life is worth something?
All lives are worth something. Let's move now into some contentions of the opposition team. Now, contention 1, you can write down as developing nations. Developing nations, and I think it's important to look to developing nations first of all, because that's the place where most often we see healthcare and education in conflict. In America, education and healthcare both exist, they both exist independently. But when we're looking at a third world nation with a very limited budget and has to choose to prioritize only one over the other, what should they do? Subpoint A, underneath here, you can write down as doctors provide healthcare. Doctors provide healthcare. In order to have effective healthcare, in order to be able to protect your people, you need to have doctors who are capable of delivering that healthcare. Subpoint B, underneath here, is that if education creates doctors. Without education, you can't have the doctors you need in order to create healthcare. And so the impact of this is that education improves life. Education improves life. Because education gives you the doctors that you need to get healthcare, it improves the lives of your citizens. Now let's move into contention 2, which you can write down as an investment. investment. Education is fundamentally an investment. And this is something that was written about by Adam Smith and David Rickard, some of the early economists, who were essentially saying that investment is the most important thing, specifically in education, because education, unlike almost everything else, doesn't suffer from the law of diminishing returns. Now, subpoint A underneath this, you can write down as human capital, human capital. When you're improving your education, you're improving your workforce. You're improving your workforce's ability to provide for themselves, which leads us to subpoint B of increased wealth. When education increases, wealth increases. It's been an essential part of all of the industrial revolutions. If you look to any modernized country, what happened first was education, and then they had the improved standard of living. So this again leads us to the impact of improved quality of life. Education improves the quality of life. Now let's move into one final contention. Contention 3 you can write down as promotes health. Promotes health. Subpoint A underneath here, you can write down as child mortality. Child mortality. If the sub-Saharan rate of infant mortalities decreased to the rate of infant mortalities among mothers with a secondary education, there would be 1.8 million less child deaths every year. Education is essential for improving and saving life. Subpoint B underneath here, you can write down as poverty. Poverty. This quotation from the Foreign Policy in December of 2015 says, quote, UN informing aid agencies to focus on information besides just handing out birth control pills to poor communities who do not know how to use this basic health care, end quote. So it's essential to teach people how to use basic health care before it can actually be of any help to them. So in this example, again, you need education before the healthcare can actually be of any benefit to you. Now let's move into responding to my opponent's contentions. His first contention was that of human life. My response to this you can write down as education allows opportunities. Education allows opportunities. Someone who's educated has the opportunity to provide for themselves. And this is extremely important, especially in his subpoint A about young versus old, where he was saying that education is only for the young, but if you're educated, it helps you throughout your entire life. His next two subpoints was about for society and mental illness, and my first response to this is, again, education allows to provide. Education allows you to provide for yourself and for your family members or yourself, whoever it is that has the mental illness. My second response you can write down as government ill-equipped. The government is ill-equipped when we're talking specifically in first world nations like America. The government is not the best person, not qualified enough to deal with mental illness. It's far too specific of an issue. It's far too important and personal of an issue for the government to put blanket policies over and expect it to work out. It's far better to educate your citizens and then allow your citizens to do what's best for themselves and for their families. Yes, sir.
Actually, never mind.
All right, let's move into contention number 2 about the contrast between. Now, his first response, or his second subpoint rather, education changing with politics, my response to this, you can write down as Obamacare. My partner made this point very eloquently in her point of information. Healthcare is just as much subject to the changing winds of politics as education is. And next he talked about North Korea. And essentially what he was saying was that in North Korea they don't have any healthcare and it's really bad, they should just educate themselves. My response to this you can write down as no opportunity. No opportunity. Yes, in America it's very easy to homeschool because we have such a great education infrastructure. But in countries like North Korea, where they're also not providing healthcare, there's also no way for those citizens to help themselves. So really in this situation as well, it's just as important, if not more, to get these people education as it is to get them healthcare. So at the end of the day, the burden of the government team is to prove to you that healthcare is more important than education. But I think it's clear that whenever given the opportunity, education should be valued above. Thank you very much.
My vast panel of judges.
By the end of this debate round, something is going to be made very clear, and that is that education is extremely important. But one thing is going to be made even more clear, and that is before education, what needs to be mastered is that of healthcare. Before we can even talk about education, we need to make sure we have laid the foundations for human life. A human cannot learn, cannot be educated without life. And that is basically the thesis of the arguments of the government team. By the end of this debate round, life must come first. I do want to make one quick observation at the beginning of this speech, and that is the fact of win in conflict. If we look through a lot of their contentions, we'll find that they might actually be true whenever we are out of conflict. It might be more important for a government to focus on education out of conflict. We are talking about win in conflict. We're going to be proving the win in conflict. It is more important to prioritize healthcare. Let's jump into the framework and the values of the round. Now, his first thing is that he talked about was he brought up a counter value, that of the quality of life. Our response to that is that of counter value, life. We're going to continue to support the first value we brought up, and we have a few standards as to why just generalized life in general, not the quality of it, but life itself is more important. The first one is, again, of foundational. Again, foundational. Life is the foundation for a quality of life. You cannot focus on how good your life is if you are dead. It is important to have a foundation laid before you can begin thinking about the quality of it. The second response is that of intrinsic. The second standard is that of intrinsic. This value is intrinsic. Life does not change. The importance of life does not change. Though your quality of life, how you value your quality of life, that does change. I would also like to point out that these standards were both dropped. These were originally brought up inside of the Prime Minister's constructive and were both dropped, so we can very clearly see life is the preferred value of this round. Let's jump down to his criterion, and his criterion was kind of off the wall. It was that of an economic advancement. I have one response to this, and that is of a counter criterion, and that is of supporting the values. Again, supporting the values. Instead of randomly going off and talking about economic advancement, even though really none of the arguments are talking about economic advancement, the resolution has something to do with economic advancement, let's talk about the values. The criterion for this debate round should be what team can best support the value of that debate round. And as we can clearly see, because of our standards, that value is life. At the end of this debate round, which team can better support life? With that being said, let's jump down to the actual contention, the actual argumentation of the debate round. His first contention was that of developing nations. He's basically talking about inside of developing nations, what is and what is not important. Now, my first response to this is that of win in conflict. Again, win in conflict. He talked about how it's important to lay this foundation and begin to train doctors, etc., so that they can work on people. But that is a good idea outside of conflict. We're talking about win in conflict whenever you have to make a decision between the two. What is important? My second response to that is already there. This is specifically a response to subpoint B of education creates doctors. Whenever we're talking about a situation when we are in conflict, it's safe to assume that the doctors are already going to be there. We're looking at a more first world nation whenever the government's asking to choose between a new policy on education or a new policy on human life. The doctors are already going to be there to support this, which is why human life is so much more important. Let's take a question.
What assurance do we have that those doctors in the third world countries are well enough educated to be able to do their job?
Right, again, like I just said, this was a response for more first world nations, but what we were saying is that in third world nations, it's also more important to first of all focus on human life. My second response to that is going to be the hierarchy. Again, the hierarchy. I'm not sure how many of you guys have actually heard of this, basically the life hierarchy, what is the most important, but basically what this says is what you have to do first. Now let's talk about actually what happens whenever a non-governmental organization or some sort of relief foundation goes to a developing country. What do they have to do to begin to get that country up out of the ground to start actually relieving victims? The first thing they're going to do is provide food, water, and healthcare. That is the first step. The reason that is the first step is because that is foundational to work on education. When in conflict, whenever you have to make a decision between the two, the first thing you have to do is work on healthcare. They provide food, they provide water, then after that they can move into things like education. We see that in third world nations, the actual empirics of what happens today is this, and there's a reason for that. Healthcare must come first because healthcare is the foundation for education. And in first world nations, when you have to decide between these, obviously the doctor's already there and there's no reason you would have to choose to make more doctors. That obviously makes no sense. Yes?
When you say empirics, where specifically are you referring to?
I was referring to whenever a relief foundation will go into a third world nation to try to raise them up or actually help in some sort of relieving way. That's what I was talking about in general. Whenever a missionary will go into another nation where they haven't actually been reached from the outside world before, what will happen is they will go there, they will provide food and water, then after that they begin to focus on the actual missionary work or the actual education. Let's go into his contention too, and basically he was talking about how this leads to increased education, leads to innovation and things like that that end up helping our economy. Again, I have a few responses to that, and that is that healthcare must come first. This is actually a direct turn on this contention. Healthcare actually causes smarter people. Let's look at an empiric of Singapore. Again, the empiric of Singapore. Right now inside of Singapore, they have better education than they have, they have better healthcare than they have within the United States. The United States is currently 34th in the world in math. Singapore is number 1. The reason for this is because they take care of learning disabilities at a young age. Then those people are actually able to learn better, and then they grow up and they're able to actually contribute to our society. What we very clearly see is this needs to come first, and actually empirically speaking, the nations that take care of this first have better results inside of the long term. Let's talk about contention 3, which is that it promotes health. Our response to that is win in conflict. Again, we're not talking about long-term, a 40-year policy, what do we have to do? We're talking about win in conflict. We realize that education can sometimes promote health, and in a good society, a stable society, education is extremely important. Win in conflict, what is more important? Very simply put, what is more important is working on healthcare. You have to save the lives of your citizens, then later on, you can work on educating them. Let's get down to our contentions. So basically, the first one is that how healthcare upholds life. You're talking about how education basically improves this. This is really just his other contention. I've already responded to this point. He also said that education allows to provide. Again, I've responded to this point, that actually if we work in healthcare first, that results in a much smarter, much stronger nation within the long term. Then talking about how the government is ill-equipped to actually handle healthcare. Our first response to that is minimum standards. What we're talking about is how the government needs to set up minimum standards and act to protect its citizens when in conflict. My second response is that the government must be involved. That the government must be involved. What we actually see is in a society where the government completely steps out of healthcare, that is much more dangerous than if they were to completely step out of education. The government must be involved in this. Going down to our second contention, which is that of the RBC contrasting him, his response to this was that education changes as well. Our response is that the science doesn't. The science behind education, political figures are often changing, but the science behind the minimum standards of healthcare never changes. That scientific fact where education is very subjective. Thank you so much.
Give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. I'm sure we've all heard this statement before, but it really applies today to today's value round. Because when we give a man to fish, which is what the government team is doing, we're simply feeding him for a day, or you'll take it for one generation. Teach a man to fish, which is what the opposition team wants to do, you will feed him for a lifetime or for generations. With that, let's move first into observation 1 of the opposition team, which you can write down. Actually, I believe this is our second observation, as government prioritizes effect. Government prioritizes effect. The government team is prioritizing healthcare over education. But as I'll be showing you today, healthcare is actually the effect of good education, which is our third observation of cause a priori. We should absolutely prioritize the cause whenever there is a conflict between a cause and an effect. And my final observation is the more you learn, the more you earn. The more you learn, the more you earn. Let's look at at our contentions through the lens of these observations. Contention number 4 is that of access to primary care. Access to primary care. Subpoint A is that of low-income neighborhoods. Low-income neighborhoods. It's a common fact that in low-income neighborhoods, access to primary care is extremely difficult. My cousin works in a dental school, and the only place where the low-income people can actually find healthcare is at her university, which provides it for free. And besides the university, no other primary care in their area will actually take these patients, and these patients aren't able to find healthcare themselves. So we see here that without education, you're not going to be able to earn much. Your standard of living is going to be extremely low. But then with education, you are going to be able to advance in life. And with that advance in life, you're going to have access to primary care. You're going to have knowledge about primary care. You're going to have knowledge about the health education that you need to sustain your family. But you disagree.
I have a clarification point, actually. Basically, you're talking about how this college provided healthcare. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay, do all colleges provide that?
No, that was specifically a dental school. Moving down to contention number 5 is that of long-term habits. Subpoint A is that of education and smoking. Now, a study was conducted with males 25 years or older, and here's what they found. In males with less than high school degrees, the smoking percentage of men who smoked was 30%. Now, in males with bachelor degrees or more, the percentage of males who smoked dropped dramatically by 1/3 to 10.4%. Similar results were found with obesity and alcohol use. The subpoint B is that of generational values. Now remember that things like smoking, alcohol, and obesity are all generational values. And in order to increase the value of life, in order to make sure that people actually are able to live, you need to make sure that you take care of the cause. So impact number 1 is that the cycle continues. If you just provide healthcare without providing education, people are simply going to be dealing with the effect, which is that of poor health and poor habits. But when you give them education, education about good lifestyle, education about good healthcare, then they're actually going to be able to pass these on to the next generation. Contention number 6 is that of government spending. Government spending. Subpoint A is that of Medicaid. Medicaid, $476 billion. The United States federal government currently spends $476 billion on Medicaid. Medicaid is health insurance, free health insurance for people with low income. And are these low income people? Mostly people who don't have education. So if you give these people education, they're going to be having higher incomes. And when they have higher incomes, they're going to be able to provide for their own health care. And this is actually my subpoint, self-sustainability. We need to make sure that people are able to sustain themselves and sustain their families. We don't want the government to be taking care of this problem for generations. If you teach a man to fish, you're going to be teaching his whole generation to fish. If you give him a fish, the government will be feeding him for generations. The impact of this contention is that of national well-being. Contention number 7 is that of increasing returns. Increasing returns. Subpoint A is that of law of diminishing returns. The law of diminishing returns basically says that everything essentially grows less effective as more is used. Subpoint B is that of human investment is different. Human investment is fundamentally different, as economists have agreed over the years. And human capital actually increases the rate of returns because it is an expansion in technology and expansion in the quality of society. So the more you invest in humans, for example, in education, the more value you get. The more you invest in something like healthcare, which is not human investment, the less you get, the more you invest. So the impact under this is, again, of next generation. By investing in education, you are investing in the next generation. You're getting more the more you invest. Contention number 8 is that of education gives life. Subpoint A is that of mortality rates. Mortality rates. In 2007, a study was conducted between people with different education rates. People without a high school diploma averaged 665.2 deaths per 100,000 people. And just to clarify, this was between 25 to 64-year-old males. So 665.2 deaths per 100,000 people. Individuals who had who did have a high school diploma averaged 600.9 deaths per 100,000 people. People with a college degree or more averaged 238.9 deaths per 100,000 people. This is about 1/3 of the people who didn't have a high school diploma and the people who did have a high school diploma. Our final contention is that of advancement of society. Now remember, the government serves the people. The government exists to promote the well-being of a society. Through education, the government will be able to further this goal. Through healthcare, the government simply makes the problem worse. The government simply makes something that it still has to fulfill generation over generation. But the more you learn, the more you earn. The more you earn, the more you have life. Thank you very much.
feel rather obligated to come up with another time. I wasn't so optimistic about that one, but you came through. Great. I'd like to start off by responding to their value. And essentially the debate here is between whether or not life should be valued over quality of life, which is a better value for this debate round. And I absolutely believe that quality of life is a better value because it, of course, includes the value of life. Of course, someone who's dead's quality of life is much worse than someone who's still alive. However, if we limit it only to looking at the value of life, then there's no difference between someone who's prospering and someone who's barely surviving. So, as a whole, whichever brings more quality of life does provide a better. Yes, sir.
I actually believe this is a new response that you did respond to foundational and intrinsic when you had a chance in the constructive speeches. Any of the judges want to comment?
We'll take that under advisement.
All right, okay.
I'm responding to our line of argumentation that I began. So, with that said, let's move into the voting issues of the opposition team. Now, I think that this round is essentially boiled down to two different spheres of debate. We're debating about what's better in developing nations and what's better in developed nations. So those are going to be my two voting issues. Voting issue number one is that of developing nations. Now, my subpoint A underneath here is that of assuming education. In his last speech, in response to my argument that you need doctors for healthcare and you need educated doctors to be able to efficiently give out healthcare, he said, well, we're assuming that the doctors are already educated. We're assuming that that infrastructure is already in place. The only way that infrastructure is already in place if education has already been prioritized above healthcare. My next response, you can write down, sort of as a continuation of good doctors, with good underlined. In order for healthcare to be effective, not only do you need doctors, but you need doctors who are good at what they're doing. And the only way you get to that is through education. Now, subpoint C underneath here is that of 1.8 million deaths. 1.8 million deaths. And this brings you back to my argument about if sub-Saharan infant mortality rates dropped to the level that they are among mothers with secondary education, there would be 1.8 million less deaths. And he responded to this by saying, well, the question is about win in conflict. And I think this is exactly what I'm advocating here. When in conflict, you have two options. One option would reduce the number of deaths per year by 1.8 million every year, which is incredibly significant. Underneath both values, whichever one you choose to accept, either life or quality of life, I believe this argument alone wins the debate round. Now, subpoint D underneath here is that of increasing returns. Increasing returns, and my partner explained this beautifully in her last speech. But when, as a third world nation's government, you have to be investing in your future. Dealing with healthcare is reacting to a problem that has already happened. Whereas investing in education is looking forward. It's proactive and it's dealing with problems that both solving the ones that exist currently and preventing future generations. So you don't have to continue to give healthcare to every successive generation. Now let's move into the second voting issue. Voting issue number 2 is that of developed nations. So we've seen that it's better to have education for a developing nation, a nation that's trying to get going, because they need that infrastructure in order to have our other basic necessities. But what about us in America? Now that we have everything, we have access to healthcare, we have access to hospitals, which is more important? Now, subpoint A underneath here is again investment. Education is an investment, and it's an investment in the future of whoever is receiving the education. That person will then, and this has not been disputed, have more money later in life. And with that extra money, will be able to better provide for themselves and their family, both avoiding some health risks, as well as being able to provide for themselves for any health risks that do arise, which is a better system than having the government take care of people who don't have the ability to take care of themselves. Now, subpoint B underneath here sort of backtracks slightly, but is that of increases wealth. This investment does increase wealth and is there to benefit people for the rest of their lives rather than just having temporary band-aids, you might call it. Subpoint C underneath here you can write down as sustainable. When we're looking to first world governments, we have to look to ways to keep our government sustainable, which is a better option. A problem that you have to continue to apply the healing for, or solving the problem at its root by giving people the education and the tools they need both to prevent and solve the problems by themselves. Subpoint D underneath here is that of increasing returns. They're increasing returns, as my partner explained, again, far better than I could. So just flow her arguments over underneath the voting issue because they're extremely important. Finally, subpoint E underneath here is that of life. set of life. As my partner outlined in her previous speech, and it does make sense, people who are well educated, people who are well informed about the risks and also have the means necessary to deal with those risks do live better and longer. Thank you very much.
Judges are ready? My brother had a fish. The problem is he forgot to feed the fish, and the fish ended up dying. The fact of the matter is that they don't have the essential needed healthcare options. They can't even have a quality of life or a life at all. Let's first off start with what the value is talking about in today's debate round. They basically said we should have the quality of life because of course you need life. The fact of the matter is that's the point. Of course you need life. Under this resolution you need to have life, and you can't have life without those necessities which are healthcare. You need the food, you need the water, you need the shelter. That's the first thing we do when we respond to third world nations, and the reason we do that and then focus on education is because we want to make sure they're healthy when it actually happens. This is an example of when it's in conflict. When you actually look at what their examples are saying, it's just saying in the long term, education is a good thing. The fact of the matter, this is one time when short term is more effective because we have to be looking at what is happening when in conflict. I'd like to point out that they dropped our entire second contention, which shows a clear point of when they are in conflict and shows direct points of how when they're in conflict, we always see that healthcare should trump. With that said, I'm going to go and show you how all their examples are basically not when in conflict. Her first example was that the idea, contention 5 was that of smoking. She basically said that the cycle is just going to continue. We never saw that when in conflict with actual health care. We never saw that they have to choose one or the other. We never saw they have to choose education or smoking. It just said smoking is bad. We all know smoking is bad. Basically, people don't always listen to education. Again, it varies. The fact of the matter is, health care is the first thing that's important. The second thing that she basically talked about is the idea of, the next point was, of the mortality. She talked about all these mortality, how all these people ended up dying, and basically education would save that. That doesn't show when healthcare and education are in opposition. It just shows that mortality happens when people don't have good education. That may be true, but they need healthcare when it's in conflict, like in these third world countries. With that said, let's go ahead now and look at their voting issues. This is going to be talking about basically their investment points. He basically said that voting issue 1 is that of the idea of developing countries, and how what needs to be done first is this idea of education when we look at all the mortalities, etc., all these other points. My first response is that of when in conflict. I'm not just going to repeat this, I'm going to put some subpoints under there to respond. This first subpoint is that of food and water. Food and water. The fact of the matter is they need things like food and water and shelter to first be able to establish this point. My second point is that of people with learning disabilities. 1 in every 5 person has a learning disability. We found out according to the, we cited this in our first speech, National Institute. Basically, they did a research on it. If you don't need the actual, we can basically, what ended up happening is they did research. Every 1 in every 5 had a mental disability. Basically, disabilities like dyslexia prevent you from actually learning because you can't actually read the words. You need to be able to work through that, understand how to read the words before you can actually learn anything. With that said, let's go ahead and talk about their voting issue 2, which is that of developing. They basically said a bunch of subpoints, which is that of millions less, and talking about how this is going to actually increase the returns if we help people. Basically, their entire idea is that if we educate people, long term they'll be able to sustain people. This is not when in conflict. Even if you educate people, first, you have doctors now, when conflict happens, you need to put the healthcare first. You don't need to start educating people. You need to provide them food, water, and shelter. That's the first thing they need before they can learn any sort of education. With that said, I'd like to present my own voting issues now in today's debate round. Voting issue 1 is that of when in conflict. Surprise, surprise. If you go back to our very first speech, I'd like to point out what all the things were we said about when in conflict. The first one is that of objective versus subjective. We see that education is subjective to when it's subjective. We see that what ends up happening is that the standard ends up changing. They actually didn't respond to this point. They dropped my partner's response to their point, basically meaning that this point stands in today's debate round. What ends up happening is because we have an objective cause, they have a subjective cause,
That proves that you should vote for us because we can prove that you need objective healthcare. Healthcare standards don't change. Education does based from person to person. We're homeschooled, there's public school, there's private schoolers. Obviously, education varies in what people believe. So it's objective, not subjective. The second point under this was that the idea of 1 in 5 adolescents have these learning disabilities. 1 in 5 adolescents have learning disabilities. Basically, if you had that choice, do we need to give them education, just force education on them when in conflict, or do we need to actually give them healthcare benefits first? We said that we need to give them those healthcare benefits, learn how to work through their problems, and then they'll be able to deal with the actual issues at hand. The next point under this is that of right now aren't doing anything. Right now aren't doing anything. We see that Obamacare, like they said, it's horrible, so we say we aren't doing anything right now, and our education is actually decreasing. We ask that you vote for us because when in conflict, you need to provide people food, shelter, and water, not with education. Thank you.